The chandelier blazed above her like 1,000 unblinking eyes, pouring light upon everyone but her. Each crystal caught the laughter of the rich and flung it back like a curse, while beneath that golden storm, Amara's hands moved with the quiet precision of someone who knew that one wrong breath could erase her existence. Tonight, the mansion glittered with power, perfume, and deceit, and deep inside that shimmering heart, fate waited, patient, merciless, unseen. She did not yet know that before dawn, the house she served would turn its brightness against her. The music of Delane Mansion rolled through the corridors like silk over stone. Every note of the violin, every pop of champagne, every careless burst of laughter seemed to mock the soundless rhythm of Amara's labor. She carried her silver tray from table to table, her steps measured, her eyes lowered, her spirit disciplined into invisibility. 3 years of servitude had taught her that the first rule of survival in a house of wealth was silence. The second was to smile, even when your heart begged for air. Mrs. Delane, tall and immaculate in black satin, presided at the head of the table. Her jewels trembled when she laughed, as though even the diamonds feared to disobey her. To her right sat Chloe, her daughter, youthful, radiant, and venomous in the untested way of the privileged. "Mother," she murmured, loud enough for every ear, "your maid moves like a ghost. I swear she enjoys haunting your parties." The guests tittered. Mrs. Delane's smile tightened. "She should be grateful to breathe such air," she said, not glancing at Amara. Amara bowed her head and whispered a single word that no one heard. Patience. She repeated it like prayer while she poured the wine, the crimson liquid gliding into crystal as smooth as habit. Around her the conversation turned to investments, scandals and charities none of them truly cared for. The air smelled of lilies and deceit. She thought briefly of her mother's last evening alive, the tiny room they had shared, and the promise she had whispered, "I'll make you proud, Mama, even if the world never sees me." The memory burned behind her eyes, a light warmer than any chandelier. "Girl!" The command cracked across the room. Mrs. Delane's hand extended toward the empty glass beside her. "More wine. Quickly." "Yes, ma'am." Amara stepped forward, the tray balanced perfectly, her fingers trembling only from fatigue. The chandelier's reflection shimmered over the tablecloth, blinding her for a heartbeat. She blinked, adjusted her grip, and in that breath of distraction, fate took its chance. The glass slipped. It spun through the air, caught the light, and shattered against the marble with a sound that silenced the orchestra. Red wine burst across the white linen, blooming like blood through snow. Every guest froze, forks suspended, eyes wide with the kind of thrill reserved for scandal. Mrs. Delane rose, slowly, her voice trembling with controlled fury. "You clumsy, ungrateful creature." "I'm sorry, ma'am," Amara whispered. "It was—" "Sorry?" Chloe's laughter was soft and poisonous. "She's probably been drinking. Look at her hands." "I haven't, Miss Chloe. I swear I haven't." Mrs. Delane's expression hardened. "Last week my ring disappeared from the dressing table. Perhaps it found its way into those hands, too." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. "I would never steal," Amara said, her voice small but steady. "Enough." The word struck her like a slap. Mrs. Delane turned to her guests, performing indignation. "I open my home to help those beneath us, and this is how gratitude repays me. There will be no thieves under my roof." Amara's lips parted, yet the room had already judged her. Faces she had served for years turned away, unwilling to meet her eyes. In that moment she understood the cruelty of gentility. It destroyed without raising its voice. Her heart pounded in her ears. The chandelier above blurred into a storm of gold. She placed the tray on the table, bowed slightly, and said the only thing left to say. "Thank you for allowing me to serve." Mrs. Delane's gaze glittered like a blade. "Pack your things. Leave before the hour ends, or I will have you escorted out." Chloe smiled, satisfied. The guests exhaled as if a scene in a play had ended. Amara turned away. Her steps echoed down the hall where portraits of the Delane ancestors stared from the walls, painted faces heavy with the arrogance of centuries. She reached the servants' quarters and gathered the few belongings she owned: a threadbare shawl, a book missing its cover, and a pair of worn shoes her mother had once repaired by candlelight. She paused by the back door, hearing the music rise again, the sound of life continuing without her, and felt the last thread binding her to this house snap quietly inside her chest. She opened the door. A gust of cold wind swept through, carrying the faint scent of rain. The night stretched before her, vast, indifferent, and empty. Somewhere beyond those iron gates lay the city that had forgotten her name, yet it was the only world she had left to walk in. As she stepped into the darkness, thunder rolled across the sky like distant applause for her defeat. Behind her, the chandelier still burned, spilling light onto a table that had already erased her existence. The rain began to fall, slow at first, then furious, washing the dust of servitude from her hands. She did not know that the same storm that cast her out would also carry her toward the stranger whose kindness would change her fate forever. Rain has a way of remembering pain, and that night it fell as though heaven itself mourned for her. The golden mansion behind her had already begun to fade into darkness, its laughter echoing like a ghost of everything she had lost. Each raindrop struck her, skin like a question. Where would she go? Who would she become, now that the only world she knew had cast her out? She walked into the storm without a destination, carrying nothing but the dignity she had refused to surrender. The city stretched before her like an endless corridor of shadows and trembling light. The cobblestones glistened beneath the downpour, reflecting fragments of car headlights and the lonely shimmer of street lamps, while thunder rolled across the sky with the indifference of a god who had stopped listening. Amara clutched her torn canvas bag close to her chest, its meager contents already soaked through: one worn dress, a small photograph of her mother, and the brittle remains of pride. Her wages had been withheld, her name stained, her future erased in a single night of cruelty. The wind howled through the alleys, tugging at her skirt, pushing her forward into a darkness that smelled of iron and regret. She moved slowly, her shoes slipping against the slick stones, her breath trembling in the cold air. Behind her, Delane Mansion glowed faintly at the top of the hill, a glittering wound against the black horizon, the chandelier's light still flickering through the rain, as though mocking her with its indestructible brilliance. For years she had cleaned those lights. Now they watched her go, unblinking, uncaring. The weight of humiliation pressed against her ribs, but beneath it something stubborn survived. The quiet pulse of her mother's voice whispering from memory. Keep your hands clean, no matter what they take from you. Dirt on your skin washes away. Dirt on your soul never will. She turned down a narrow lane where puddles mirrored the gray sky. Water soaked through her shoes, numbing her feet, yet she could not stop. To stop would be to think, and to think would be to break. The city was awake around her, cars hissing through the rain, distant music leaking from tavern doors, the smell of frying food from unseen stalls, but none of it belonged to her. She was an intruder in a world that had no room for those without wealth or witnesses. Her vision blurred. Tears mingled with the rain until she could no longer tell them apart. A flash of lightning illuminated the street ahead, and in that instant, she saw herself reflected in a shop window. Hair plastered to her face, eyes hollow with disbelief, dress clinging to her thin frame. The sight struck her harder than the cold. She looked away quickly, ashamed of her own reflection. She wanted to scream, to demand why kindness was always punished, but the wind carried her voice away before it could form. At the corner, the pavement ended in a small bus stop, an iron frame with a cracked roof and a flickering light that buzzed like a trapped insect. She stumbled beneath it and collapsed onto the bench, breathless. The sound of the rain drumming above her filled the silence between sobs. Around her, the city continued without pause, a living thing made of motion and indifference. Her stomach twisted with hunger, but she had no coin, no friend, no plan. The thought of returning to the slums where she had grown up filled her with equal parts fear and shame. She had promised herself she would never go back. Time blurred into a slow rhythm of rain and heartbeat. She wrapped her shawl tighter, though it was drenched and useless, and let her thoughts drift toward her mother. She remembered how the older woman's hands had always been warm, how she had sung softly while mending clothes, how she had said that faith was a light that only truly shines in darkness. When the world turns its back, keep walking, Amara. God watches from the rain. The memory made her chest ache, but it also gave her the strength to lift her head and face the street again. A gust of wind carried the distant sound of tires cutting through water. 2 headlights appeared at the far end of the road, piercing the rain like twin stars moving closer, slower, more deliberate than any passing car. Amara straightened instinctively, every muscle tightening with alarm. The vehicle was large, sleek, its black surface swallowing the reflections of the streetlights. It stopped in front of the shelter with the stillness of a predator deciding whether to pounce or to protect. For a moment, nothing happened. The engine purred, the rain hissed, the night held its breath. Then the tinted window lowered halfway, releasing a faint stream of warm air that smelled of leather and mystery. Through the misted glass, she saw him, a man seated in the shadows, his profile cut sharp by the pale glow of the dashboard. His suit was dark, his posture unhurried, his gaze steady in a way that made her feel both seen and stripped bare. She froze. Fear and exhaustion warred inside her. Should she run? Should she beg for a ride? For mercy? For anything? Pride whispered that she needed no one. Desperation whispered that she could not survive another hour in the cold. The man didn't move, only watched her as if waiting for her to decide what kind of story she wanted this night to become. Raindrops slid down the car door like tears she refused to shed. The silence between them stretched until it became unbearable. The thunder cracked again, closer this time, shaking the thin metal roof above her. Her heart thudded once, twice, then stopped when the man finally spoke. His voice was deep and calm, cutting cleanly through the storm, rich with authority, yet softened by something she couldn't name. Fatigue, perhaps, or compassion worn thin by time. "Do you need help?" he asked, his tone neither invitation nor command. "Or are you too proud to ask for it?" The words hung in the rain, heavy and impossible to ignore, threading through the night like the first note of a song she had been waiting her whole life to hear. Amara stared at him, the storm reflected in her wide, uncertain eyes. Somewhere deep within her, a warning whispered that every rescue comes with a price. Yet beneath that fear, a fragile hope stirred, because perhaps, just perhaps, this stranger in the rain wasn't danger at all, but the beginning of her deliverance. He emerged from the darkness like a secret the night had been waiting to reveal, his presence slicing through the rain with quiet authority and impossible calm. His eyes carried the kind of silence that only grief could teach, and his face bore the tired grace of a man who had once held the world in his hands, only to lose what truly mattered. Power radiated from him, not loud or cruel, but deep and steady, like the heartbeat of the storm itself. Amara could not tell whether the stranger had come to save her, or to remind her that mercy in this world always came with a price. The rain had softened into mist by the time the black car settled before her, like a shadow that had taken shape. Its engine purred, steady and restrained, a contrast to the thunder still rumbling somewhere far beyond the skyline. Amara stood beneath the fragile cover of the bus shelter, clutching the umbrella he had given her as though it were a relic from another world. She could barely see his face through the veil of rain, but the outline of him, broad-shouldered, still unshaken, made the rest of the night seem less real, as though time itself had paused to watch what would happen next. When the car door opened, a rush of warm air escaped, scented faintly with leather, cedar, and something clean, but lonely. The man stepped out with the effortless composure of someone accustomed to commanding spaces simply by existing in them. Ethan Cole was known to the city's newspapers as a billionaire philanthropist, an entrepreneur who had turned steel and vision into empires. But beneath the tailored coat, beneath the composed expression and the name that commanded respect, there was the private ruin of a man who had buried his joy 3 winters ago beside the woman he could not save. Since then, every breath he took felt borrowed, every success hollow, every sunrise a reminder that survival is sometimes the cruelest punishment of all. He looked at Amara now, her thin frame shivering in the rain, her soaked dress clinging to skin that had known more struggle than comfort, and he felt a flicker of something he had forgotten, an ache that was not pity, but recognition. "You shouldn't be standing here," he said finally, his voice low but even, the kind that carried more weight than volume ever could. "The storm isn't kind to those who have nowhere to go." Amara's eyes lifted, meeting his for the first time. In that moment, 2 broken worlds looked at each other, the one gilded by power and loss, the other stripped bare by injustice and endurance. She hesitated, her lips parting, unsure whether to answer or retreat. "I'm fine," she whispered, though the tremor in her voice betrayed the lie. "You should go." Ethan studied her carefully, noticing the torn strap of her bag, the cuts on her hands, the defiance that still burned through exhaustion. He recognized the stubbornness of someone who refused to beg, even when the world demanded it. "You think accepting help is weakness," he said softly, almost to himself. "It isn't." Her eyes hardened. "You wouldn't understand." A faint smile tugged at his lips, sad, knowing. "You'd be surprised what I understand." The silence between them was strange, not empty but charged, as if the rain itself had become an audience to something sacred and small. Ethan reached into the car and pulled out an umbrella, identical to the one she held, but untouched by rain. "Here," he said, holding it out. "Keep it. The one you have is broken." She looked down and saw that he was right. The ribs of the umbrella she clutched had bent inward, its fabric torn. Her pride screamed to refuse, but her body betrayed her as her fingers reached forward and brushed his hand. The touch was fleeting. Skin against skin, warmth against cold, but it left an echo that neither could ignore. Their eyes met again, and for an instant, the sound of the rain faded until all that existed was that impossible connection between 2 strangers who shared nothing but loneliness. "I can take you somewhere safe," he said. "A shelter, or at least out of the cold." Amara shook her head. "No. You've done enough." "You think an umbrella is enough?" he asked quietly, almost to himself. "For tonight, yes," she said. "For someone like me, it's more than I expected." Ethan wanted to argue, but something in her tone silenced him. She wasn't weak. She wasn't asking. She was surviving, and there was an elegance to that which humbled him more than any boardroom or headline ever had. So he nodded once, closed the umbrella he had offered, and placed it gently in her bag instead. "Then at least let this stay with you," he said. "You'll know where to find me if you change your mind." He turned, returning to the car without waiting for thanks. The engine stirred again, headlights cutting through the fading storm as the vehicle pulled away, leaving a trail of rippling reflections in its wake. Amara watched it go, her breath trembling in her chest. The road seemed emptier now that he was gone, yet a strange calm lingered where fear had lived just moments before. She didn't know why his words had touched her, or why his voice, so measured, so full of unspoken sorrow, echoed in her mind, like a melody she could not forget. By the time dawn crept across the horizon, The rain had thinned to a soft drizzle. Amara's clothes clung to her skin, but the cold no longer felt cruel. It felt cleansing, almost like the night had washed away everything that had tied her to her past. She gathered her things and began to walk again, her feet splashing through shallow puddles that reflected a pale sunrise. The city around her stirred awake, street sweepers moving like ghosts, shopkeepers unlocking their doors, life returning to its rhythm. She had no destination, only motion, but somehow that was enough. When she reached a quiet corner where the morning light pooled between buildings, she paused to rest. Her fingers slipped inside her bag to check for her belongings, and something new brushed against her hand. A small dry rectangle that did not belong. Frowning, she pulled it out. It was a card, heavy paper, elegant, with black embossed letters that gleamed faintly in the weak sunlight. E. Cole Foundation. Beneath it, in smaller print, were the words, "Building Futures, Restoring Faith." Her heart stuttered. He must have slipped it into her bag when he placed the umbrella there. She stared at it, rainwater dripping from her hair onto the card until the letters blurred slightly, like destiny itself testing whether she was ready to read it. A strange mix of fear and wonder filled her. Why me? She thought. What could a man like him want with someone like me? Yet deep inside, under layers of weariness and caution, a quiet flame of possibility flickered to life. She held the card up beneath the trembling glow of a streetlight, the name E. Cole shining through the thin veil of dawn like a whisper from another world. Was this the hand of fate reaching out to her through the storm, or a test disguised as kindness? The city around her remained indifferent, but the air felt charged, as though something enormous had just shifted beneath the skin of the morning. She pressed the card to her heart, torn between disbelief and fragile hope. Somewhere beyond the waking streets, destiny was already turning its wheel, and Amara had just stepped into its path. Hunger has a voice that begins in the stomach, but ends in the soul, whispering questions pride refuses to answer. It speaks louder each morning you wake with nothing but dignity to feed on. Louder each night you pretend the emptiness inside you is strength. Amara had learned that hunger was not just the absence of food. It was the echo of injustice, the sound of being unseen. And as she stepped into the gray dawn of a new life, that sound followed her like a ghost that would not sleep. The days after the storm unfolded in a blur of exhaustion and endurance. Amara wandered through the city, clutching the card marked E. Cole Foundation, turning it over in her hand until the edges began to soften, unsure whether to treat it as a promise or a warning. She needed work, not miracles. Rent, not redemption. The glittering name on the card felt like a story that belonged to someone else, and so she tucked it into the lining of her worn bag and tried to forget it existed. By the third morning, desperation led her to a small diner that crouched between two crumbling apartment blocks, its flickering sign barely spelling Rose Cafe. The windows were fogged with grease, the smell of burnt coffee clinging to the air, and the floor trembled slightly every time the subway passed underneath. The owner, a tired woman named Mrs. Laird, hired Amara on the spot when she saw her hands, small, quick, used to hard work. Washing, cleaning, closing. Cash at the end of the week if you last that long, she said, sliding a bucket across the counter. We don't do pity here. Amara nodded, grateful even for the indifference. The sink became her new universe, a world of steam, soap, and silence. She worked from dawn until midnight, her reflection warping in the metal of the dishes she scrubbed. The heat scalded her palms until the skin peeled, but she said nothing. Her co-workers, hardened by their own defeats, mocked her accent, her quietness, her careful posture. "New girl thinks she's too good to sweat," one of them laughed. She smiled faintly and kept washing. If there was one thing her life had taught her, it was that dignity was a private language. Evenings were the worst. The diner filled with the city's forgotten, Drivers, drifters, men whose dreams had dissolved into routine. Amara served them soup and coffee, accepting coins that left her fingertips smelling of rust. Yet somewhere inside that endless repetition, she began to notice small moments of grace. An old couple sharing one meal instead of two, a child offering his mother the larger half of a sandwich. Kindness, she realized, was not a luxury. It was the only currency left to the poor. One night, as she stepped outside after closing, the rain returned, not furious this time, but soft and cold, as if testing whether she was still listening. The street was nearly empty, except for a blind man standing by the curb, his white cane tapping uncertainly at the edge of a puddle. The traffic lights blinked red, yellow, green, their reflections spinning in the wet asphalt. Without hesitation, Amara walked to him and took his hand gently. "Let me help you," she said. He smiled, the kind of smile that carried its own light, and together they crossed the street through the hiss of tires and the chill of wind. On the other side, he thanked her with a voice that sounded older than time. "The world still sees you," he whispered. She did not understand what he meant until later. What Amara did not notice was the figure watching from across the street, a woman holding a briefcase, standing under the awning of a parked sedan. She had been waiting there on assignment, her umbrella angled just enough to shield her view. When Amara led the blind man to safety, the woman lowered her umbrella slightly and made a note in a small leather book. The next morning, sunlight slipped through the smudged windows of the diner, laying thin gold stripes across the floor. Amara arrived early, as always, scrubbing the counter before the others came in. The bell above the door rang, and the postman stepped inside, shaking rain from his cap. "Delivery for Miss Amara," he called. She blinked in surprise. No one ever sent her mail. He handed her a sealed cream-colored envelope, stamped with an Aiki, insignia she almost didn't recognize until her heart gave a violent jolt. E. Cole Foundation. Her breath caught. The world seemed to tilt. Mrs. Laird glanced up from her ledger. "You gonna open it or stare till it disappears?" Amara retreated to the corner of the room, her fingers trembling as she tore the seal. Inside was a letter printed on thick paper. "Dear Ms. Amara, you are invited for a preliminary interview for a position within the E. Cole Foundation. Details enclosed. Sincerely, Administrative Office." Her vision blurred at the edges. She read the words again and again, trying to convince herself they were real. Had he sent it? The man from the storm? Or was this some cruel coincidence? A name shared, a door that would close the moment she touched it. She folded the letter carefully, her thoughts a whirl of disbelief and fear. Pride urged her to ignore it, to stay hidden where disappointment couldn't reach her. But another voice, quieter, older, her mother's voice, whispered, "When destiny knocks, even the smallest heart must answer." That evening, she packed her bag with the same care she had once used to pack her life. The street seemed brighter than usual as she walked toward the glass tower that bore the name Cole Foundation in sleek silver letters. It stood like a monument to everything she had never had: order, power, security. She hesitated at the entrance, watching her reflection shimmer in the revolving door. The woman staring back at her was not the maid who had been thrown out into the rain. She was something new, fragile yet unbroken. Inside, the lobby smelled of marble and ambition. She approached the receptionist, her voice barely steady. "I'm here for an interview." The woman at the desk smiled politely, typed her name, and handed her a visitor badge. "Top floor," she said. "Take the elevator to executive offices." Amira's heart raced as she stepped into the mirrored elevator. The doors slid closed with a sigh, sealing her inside with her own reflection. The floor numbers blinked upward, each one echoing like a heartbeat in her chest. She tried to breathe, to steady herself, but with every passing second the air seemed thinner. She had no idea what she would say, what position she was being considered for, or why she, of all people, had been chosen. The memory of his voice drifted back to her, the calm certainty beneath the storm. Do you need help? Or are you too proud to ask for it? The elevator chimed softly, the doors gliding open to reveal the top-floor hallway. For a moment she couldn't move. Light poured in through tall glass windows, washing the world below in silver. A single figure stood at the far end of the corridor, framed by that light, his back turned toward her as if carved from stillness itself. When he turned, the world seemed to narrow to the space between them. His gaze found hers, sharp, searching, and impossibly familiar. It was him, the man from the storm, standing in the brightness like a memory, given flesh. His eyes locked on hers, and in that instant, the noise of the city, the hum of the elevator, even the ache of her own heartbeat faded into silence. She did not know if fate had brought her here for redemption or for another fall, only that she had stepped once more into the light that had first found her in the rain. And as the doors slid shut behind her, she realized that whatever this meeting meant, it would change everything she thought she knew about mercy, trust, and herself. He didn't test her skills, he tested her silence, as though he wanted to know how deeply her pain had taught her to listen. His questions were not about work or experience, but about the quiet places where character hides when the world isn't watching. Every word between them was a thread pulled tight between dignity and doubt. And somewhere beneath his composure, she sensed that this interview was not about a job. It was about truth, the kind that exposes both the questioner and the questioned. For the first time in years, Amara felt that the air around her was deciding her future, breath by trembling breath. The office at the top of the tower was large enough to hold silence, as if it were furniture. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling glass, spilling across polished wood and the faint gleam of steel. Behind a vast desk sat Ethan Cole, the man whose eyes had once found her in the storm. He was dressed in black, his tie slightly loosened, as though formality itself bowed to his restlessness. When she entered, he looked up, not startled, not cold, but with a kind of recognition that made her pulse quicken despite herself. "Miss Amara," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "I read your file." Her fingers tightened on her bag. "There isn't much to read, sir." He smiled faintly, the expression both weary and genuine. Sometimes less tells more. The interview began not with paperwork or formalities, but with silence. Ethan studied her, and she, unsure where to rest her gaze, studied the patterns of sunlight on the floor. Finally, he said, "I don't believe in standard questions. I'd rather know who a person is than what they can do. Tell me, what would you do if the world called you a thief?" The air thickened. The question struck her like an echo from another lifetime. Images flared. The broken glass, the spilled wine, Mrs. Delane's cold voice accusing her of crimes she hadn't committed. For a moment she couldn't breathe. Then she lifted her head, meeting his eyes. Her voice was calm, almost tender. "I would let time defend me," she said, "because truth doesn't need noise. It just needs patience." Ethan leaned back slowly, his gaze steady. "You believe time is fair?" "I believe it remembers," she replied. For a long moment, neither spoke. Something unseen passed between them, a mutual recognition, not of status or circumstance, but of loneliness. Ethan saw in her the resilience of someone who had walked through ruin and refused to come out bitter. Amara saw in him the quiet ache of a man haunted not by failure, but by loss, too great to name. He broke the silence with a quiet nod. "You start tomorrow. Assistant to the director. Probationary basis." Her breath caught. "Sir, You'll learn quickly," he said, already signing the papers. "I can tell." The next morning, Amara reported to the Cole Mansion, a sprawling estate built on the city's edge, where wealth lived not in noise, but in absence, the kind of silence that only memory could fill. The marble floors gleamed like water. The walls carried the faint scent of cedar and lilies, and the chandeliers above seemed gentler than those of her past, as though light itself had been taught to grieve here. She was escorted to her office, a small room connected to Ethan's study by a single oak door. The house staff treated her with the formal politeness reserved for someone both new and temporary. As days unfolded, she learned his rhythms, the way he paused before answering questions, how he kept every promise but never spoke of his personal life, how he stood by the window each evening just before dusk, staring at something beyond the horizon. Their conversations were brief, careful, yet layered with an intimacy neither of them intended. Sometimes she caught him watching her, not in curiosity, but in thought, as though trying to remember where he had seen her before, or perhaps wondering if she had stepped out of a memory he had not yet made peace with. He never raised his voice. He never smiled without meaning it. And every time he addressed her, it was with the kind of respect that made her uneasy, as if he saw something in her she had not yet learned to see in herself. Slowly, a fragile trust began to form, unspoken, unacknowledged, but real. One evening, as twilight dripped into the corridors, Amara stayed late to organize documents for a board meeting. The mansion was quieter than usual. Even the clocks seemed to tick with restraint. Outside, rain began again, gentle and persistent, tapping against the windows like the rhythm of distant footsteps. She worked steadily, losing track of time, her thoughts softening under the hum of solitude. On Ethan's desk lay a stack of folders labeled in neat, deliberate handwriting. She moved them aside carefully, wiping dust from the surface beneath. One folder slipped free and fell open across her hand. She meant to close it immediately, until her eyes caught the photograph clipped to the first page. It was a woman. The image was black and white, slightly faded at the edges. Her face was delicate, framed by dark hair, her smile gentle but hauntingly familiar. Beneath the photograph, in crisp type, were two words that made Amara's pulse stutter. Isabella Cole, deceased. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt. The silence grew heavy, pressing against her chest. She knew she should close the file, pretend she had never seen it. But something in the woman's eyes held her captive. There was kindness there, and pain, and the unmistakable softness of someone who had once been deeply loved. She glanced toward the door, closed, silent, the sound of her own breathing suddenly loud in her ears. Amara closed the folder with trembling hands, her heart pounding in the hollow quiet of the room. She told herself to forget the name, to erase the image, but the woman's face lingered behind her eyes like an echo she could not silence. Somewhere in the mansion, she heard footsteps, steady, deliberate, drawing closer. She slipped the folder back into place, forcing calm into her breath, but the truth had already touched her. In that moment, she knew that whatever story she had stepped into, its ghosts were not done speaking yet. Some wounds don't bleed. They breathe through locked drawers and whisper through papers, meant to be forgotten. They wait patiently in the corners of quiet rooms, clinging to ink and memory, surviving long after the people who caused them have turned to dust. Amara didn't mean to open the wound. She had only touched a file, yet the air that escaped from it carried the scent of loss so raw it silenced her breath. That night, she learned that grief has a way of haunting even those who never caused it, and that some secrets are kept not for protection, but for survival. The photo of Isabella Cole stared back at her with a smile so gentle, it almost felt like forgiveness. Beneath the photograph, the papers told the rest of the story in the sterile language of corporate reports, words too cold to describe the wreckage they contained. Isabella, wife of Ethan Cole, had died in a car crash 3 years ago. The accident had been ruled mechanical failure, but further down the page, another name appeared in bold. A business partner indicted for negligence, later accused of deliberate tampering. A betrayal buried beneath contracts and confidentiality clauses. Amara's eyes traced the words, trying to understand the man she worked for through the story of the woman he had lost. The pieces fit together now, the distance in his voice, the way his gaze seemed to drift beyond the present, the heaviness that clung to him like a second skin. She realized with a sudden ache that Ethan's silence wasn't arrogance. It was mourning. Every choice, every movement, every controlled breath he took was an act of remembering and forgetting at once. She wanted to close the file, to return the ghosts to their paper tomb, but her hands refused to move. For a moment, she simply stood there, suspended between curiosity and compassion, between intrusion and empathy. The sound of footsteps in the corridor jolted her back to herself. Panic fluttered in her chest. She slid the folder shut, her fingers trembling, and tucked it exactly where it had been. The click of the drawer felt louder than thunder. She turned off the desk lamp, stepped away, and tried to steady her heartbeat. When she looked up, her reflection in the glass window looked like someone else. Someone older, wiser, marked by knowledge she hadn't asked for. She whispered into the darkness, "I'm sorry," though she didn't know if she was apologizing to Ethan, to Isabella, or to fate itself. The next morning dawned clear and sharp. The mansion bathed in the kind of golden light that makes sorrow look almost beautiful. Amara entered Ethan's study early, arranging documents, preparing coffee, trying to lose herself in routine. When he arrived, he seemed more at ease than usual, as if the sunlight had given him permission to breathe. "You're early," he said softly. "I find mornings quieter," she replied. "They are," he agreed, glancing at her over the rim of his coffee cup. "And quieter people tend to notice what others miss." She froze, afraid he somehow knew what she had done, but there was no accusation in his tone, only an observation, tinged with something almost like gratitude. Over the next few days, Ethan began to speak more, not about business, but about smaller things, music, art, the garden that Isabella had designed before she died. He never mentioned his wife directly, but Amara could hear her in every pause, every unfinished sentence. She listened without interruption, offering no advice, no pity, just presence. And slowly, imperceptibly, the house began to breathe again. He started having his coffee in the garden instead of behind his desk. She noticed how the lines around his eyes softened when sunlight touched them, how the shadows in his voice lightened when he spoke to her. In the evenings, when she worked late filing reports, she sometimes heard the faint notes of a piano drifting through the halls. Hesitant at first, then sure, as though the mansion itself was learning to remember joy. Their connection remained unspoken, fragile, bound by respect, and something neither of them dared to name. But not everyone in the house found peace in their quiet understanding. Among the senior staff, whispers began to stir. The head of operations, Marcus Hale, had served Ethan for years and considered himself untouchable. He noticed the changes, the late hours Amara spent in the office, the way Ethan's gaze softened when she entered the room, the faint smile that sometimes crossed his face when she spoke. What Marcus saw as danger, others dismissed as rumor, but jealousy has a way of turning rumor into ruin. One afternoon, Marcus lingered outside the study after delivering a set of contracts. Through the slightly open door, he saw Amara leaning over the desk, organizing files with the precision of someone who cared. Ethan stood nearby, listening as she explained a new system she had devised to streamline correspondence. Their interaction was entirely professional, but envy rarely needs truth to justify itself. Marcus turned away with a quiet smirk, already plotting how to turn their closeness into scandal. Days passed, and Amara sensed tension in the air without knowing its source. The other employees grew distant, their smiles brittle, their conversations halting when she entered the room. She buried herself in work, refusing to let suspicion cloud her purpose. Yet, at night, when the halls fell silent and she worked alone beneath the soft hum of the desk lamp, she sometimes felt watched. A faint disturbance in the stillness, a flicker of movement just beyond the edge of vision. She told herself it was an imagination, born of fatigue. One night, while she was reviewing quarterly reports, The uneasy feeling returned stronger. The air felt heavier, charged with something unseen. She shook it off, focusing on her task, unaware that just beyond the half-closed door, someone stood in the shadows of the corridor, camera in hand. The faint red light of the lens blinked once, twice, like an eye-opening. Inside the study, Amara reached for a file and paused. The scent of lilies drifted faintly through the open window, the same fragrance that always lingered near Ethan's late wife's portrait. She smiled sadly, whispering, "Rest now," before returning to her work. The unseen figure outside adjusted the focus, the soft click of the camera nearly lost beneath the rustle of papers. From the darkness of the hallway, the camera flashed silently, capturing the image of Amara standing at Ethan's desk, her face lit by the glow of the lamp. The watcher lowered the lens, satisfaction curving his lips into a smile sharp enough to draw blood. In his mind, the story was already written. A headline, a scandal, a downfall waiting to unfold. Inside the study, unaware of the trap being set, Amara continued her work with the peace of someone who finally believed the storm had passed. But beyond the walls, another kind of storm had just begun to gather. The higher the tower, the deeper the traps built beneath it, for envy does not attack from below. It climbs, smiling, waiting for a moment when trust looks away. In houses of glass and gold, betrayal wears perfume and a perfect suit, and the knife it carries is always shaped like truth. Amara had risen from ashes into light, but light drew shadows, and somewhere in the corridors she walked every day, one of those shadows had already chosen her name. Fate, once gentle, was preparing to turn its face again. The mansion had grown quiet in its elegance, but beneath its calm, whispers had begun to move like cracks through marble. Marcus Hale, senior executive, once Ethan's most trusted aide, now found himself eclipsed by a woman whose very presence threatened his pride. He told himself it wasn't jealousy. It was order, justice, the restoration of hierarchy. But envy is clever enough to disguise itself as logic. Watching Amara work beside Ethan, listening to the way Ethan trusted her judgment, had become unbearable. Each nod of approval, each small smile of gratitude, was another thread pulling at the web Marcus had woven around himself. He began with simple malice. Rumors whispered at lunches, small lies dropped into the right ears. But when those failed to shift Ethan's faith, Marcus turned his cunning into craft. From years of service, he knew every corner of the Cole Foundation's systems, every password and protocol. Late one night, under the glow of his desk lamp, he began fabricating documents, spreadsheets, emails, payment records, all pointing to a single false story. That Amara had been siphoning funds from a scholarship account into a private one. The amounts were small enough to seem believable, large enough to stain her forever. He saved the files under her access code, copied signatures that looked too perfect, and smiled at his reflection in the dark window. "No one ever sees the loyal ones until we remind them why they should," he whispered to himself. When he was done, he sat back, the faint hum of the servers behind him sounding like applause from the devil himself. The next morning began as any other. Amara arrived early, her presence quiet, her smile gentle. Ethan greeted her in the hallway, his voice carrying the calm warmth she had come to trust. "We'll review the education grants this afternoon," he said. "Your report last week impressed the board." She nodded, humbled and grateful, unaware that the same report had already been altered, poisoned by Marcus's deceit. By midday, Ethan's phone rang. The tone of the call shifted the air around him. His face hardened as he listened, and when he hung up, the silence in the room was sharp enough to cut glass. "Send Marcus Hale to my office," he said to his secretary, then turned to his screen. Files glowed back at him. Figures, transactions, approvals, all under Amara's digital signature. His jaw tightened. For the first time since she had entered his world, doubt touched his heart. Marcus arrived, feigning confusion. "You called for me, sir." Ethan's tone was measured. "Explain this." He turned the monitor toward him. Marcus leaned forward, his face a picture of shock. "Sir, I don't know what to say. I only noticed the discrepancies last night, but I thought perhaps it was an error. I didn't want to accuse anyone without proof." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "And yet here you are, perfectly ready with a theory." "Only concerned, sir," Marcus replied softly, lowering his gaze. "You trusted her quickly. Perhaps too quickly." The words landed like poison, disguised as reason. Ethan said nothing, but the silence in his chest was heavy with disbelief. He dismissed Marcus and sat alone for a long while, staring at the screen as if trying to find the truth between the lines. The idea of Amara doing such a thing felt impossible, yet the evidence, numbers, accounts, emails, spoke with the precision of fact. Trust is a fragile architecture. Once a single doubt enters its design, even love cannot hold it steady. When Amara was called into the office that afternoon, she sensed the shift immediately. Ethan's tone was different, formal, restrained. The light in his eyes was guarded. "Sit down," he said, his voice distant. "There are some irregularities in the Foundation's records. Transactions under your name that don't belong." Her breath caught. "Sir, I don't understand." He turned the screen toward her. Her signature glowed beside figures she had never seen. The room tilted. The air grew thinner. "I want to believe that," he interrupted gently. "Truly I do." Her heart pounded. "Please. I've never touched money that wasn't mine." He looked at her for a long time, as though searching for a lie, and finding only pain. But the evidence was merciless, its logic flawless. "Then how do you explain this?" he asked quietly. "I can't," she whispered, tears forming though she refused to let them fall. "Because it isn't real." For a long, endless moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was filled with everything that had been building. Trust, hope, the fragile thread of affection. Neither dared. It trembled now, ready to break. Finally she stood. "If you believe I could betray you," she said softly, "then there's nothing I can say to change it." "Amara," he began, but she shook her head. "I begged once for someone to believe me," she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "I will not beg again." He felt the words cut through him like a blade of truth he didn't want to feel. Her grace, her restraint, the quiet nobility in her surrender, everything about her mirrored the strength that had first drawn him to her. And yet, doubt, once seeded, grows fast in the fertile soil of fear. He turned away, his voice low. "You're suspended until I know the truth." Her knees almost gave way, but she caught herself. "I understand." "Leave tonight," he added, still facing the window, because he could not bear the look in her eyes. The press had already begun to stir. Marcus's leaks had found their way into whispers online. Anonymous reports of financial misconduct within the Cole Foundation. By evening, the mansion buzzed with rumor. Amara walked through its halls with her head high, the same way she had walked out of Delane Mansion on the night her world first fell apart. History, it seemed, was a cruel perfectionist. It liked its tragedies to repeat. She packed her few belongings into a small box, her movements slow but steady. Each object she touched carried a memory. Papers she had organized, pens she had borrowed, the faint scent of the garden she had helped restore. Outside, the sky darkened, heavy with an approaching storm. As she crossed the marble floor one last time, she paused by the grand staircase, her reflection trembling in its polished surface. "I didn't steal this time, either," she whispered to herself. "But perhaps truth takes longer to find me than lies." Behind her, footsteps approached, measured, unhurried, echoing through the vast silence. Ethan stood in the corridor, his face carved in conflict, his voice low but final. "Until I know the truth," he said, "you're suspended. Leave tonight." The words fell between them like a verdict that neither of them believed, but both were forced to obey. Amara lowered her gaze, her tears hidden by dignity, and walked past him into the rain that waited outside. The same rain that had once offered her salvation, now welcoming her back into exile. History has a cruel way of repeating itself. The same rain, the same goodbye, only the silence between them heavier this time. It was as if the universe, incapable of inventing new grief, simply rewrote the old one with sharper ink. Amara walked once more beneath a sky that had learned how to weep for her, and though her heart ached with the weight of betrayal, her dignity held her upright, refusing to collapse where the world wanted her to kneel. She had been thrown out before, but this time she was walking away by choice. Not broken, only tired of proving she had never been a thief. The rain had returned, soft but unrelenting, tracing the same cold patterns on the city's glass and stone. Amara moved through it like a quiet ghost, her bag pressed against her chest, her steps measured and unhurried. Behind her, the lights of Cole Mansion shimmered faintly through the downpour. A palace of power now blurred by the same storm that had once brought her into Ethan's life. She did not look back. Some endings are too sacred for a witness. By the time she reached the edge of the city, the streets had emptied. The train station loomed ahead, its platform flickering under the pale lamps, the air thick with the scent of steel and departure. She rented a tiny room above a tailor's shop, a place with peeling wallpaper, a leaking window, and a single bed pressed against the wall. But it was hers, and in its quiet corners she could finally breathe without feeling watched. The owner, a weary woman with kind eyes, left her an old sewing machine and a folded note that read, "It still works, so can you." Amara began stitching her survival back together, thread by thread. By day, she repaired torn sleeves for railway workers and hemmed skirts for waitresses who couldn't afford new ones. By night, she sat by the window, the sound of trains filling the darkness like mechanical heartbeats. Each passing whistle reminded her of everything that kept moving while she remained still. Her fingers bled from the needle, her back ached, but she found a strange peace in the repetition. It was not the life she wanted, but it was honest, and after losing everything twice, honesty felt like a luxury she could still afford. She told herself she no longer thought about Ethan Cole, but truth has its own persistence. He appeared in the edges of her mind, in the color of dawn against glass, in the echo of footsteps on marble, in the sound of rain tapping against the window. She would remember the way he said her name, the hesitation in his eyes the moment before he sent her away. And though she tried to convince herself he had become like everyone else, another voice quick to doubt, part of her heart, refused to hate him. It was easier to believe he had been misled than to believe he had stopped caring. Across the city, Ethan sat alone in his study, the storm painting restless shadows across his face. The documents that had condemned her lay spread across his desk, each number and signature suddenly feeling like an accusation against his own blindness. Sleep evaded him. The silence of the house, once a comfort, now pressed against him like punishment. Her voice echoed in his memory. "I begged once for someone to believe me. I will not beg again." Every time he closed his eyes, that sentence cut deeper, reminding him that in trying to protect his empire, he had destroyed the one soul who had never wanted anything from him but faith. It was his assistant, Clara, who found the first crack in the illusion. "Sir," she said hesitantly the next morning, standing at his office door, "I've been rechecking the Foundation's digital logs. Some of the access timestamps don't match the transaction entries. Whoever used Amara's ID did so after her badge was logged out for the night." Ethan looked up sharply. "Are you certain?" "Yes. And there's more. The data signatures trace back to Marcus Hale's terminal." Her voice trembled slightly. "I think someone wanted her gone, sir." The words struck him like thunder. He rose from his chair, the shock dissolving into rage and disbelief. "Get me everything," he ordered. Within hours, the evidence unfolded before him. The fabricated reports, the forged signatures, the deliberate leaks to the press. Each discovery tore at him until shame settled in his chest, heavier than grief. He had been betrayed again, not by an enemy, but by the man he had trusted most. And in punishing Amara, he had repeated the same sin that had destroyed his peace years ago, believing in deceit instead of loyalty. He found Marcus that evening in the boardroom. The confrontation was silent, surgical, final. Marcus's excuses died in his throat when Ethan laid the evidence before him, each document a mirror reflecting his corruption. "You didn't ruin her reputation," Ethan said coldly. "You ruined mine." He dismissed him with the same authority that once had made him untouchable. But victory did not bring relief. The damage had already been done. That night, Ethan sat in the dark, the rain whispering against the windows. Every sound of the storm carried Amara's absence. He remembered the look in her eyes as she walked past him, how her silence had been heavier than words. For the first time since Isabella's death, he felt something raw, something dangerous. Regret mixed with longing, and the realization that redemption doesn't wait. It walks away. By dawn, he could no longer sit still. He searched her records, traced her last payment, followed her trail through the city, until he found the name of the landlord near the station. The car sped through narrow streets, still wet from the rain, his reflection flickering in the passing glass. Each turn of the wheel felt like an apology racing against time. When he arrived, the air smelled of damp earth and coal. He climbed the narrow stairs to the room number on the paper, his heartbeat pounding louder than the rain outside. The door stood half open, the small room empty except for the sewing machine, a few spools of thread, and a folded blanket on the chair. He stepped inside, his gaze landing on the table where a teacup sat half full, the tea long gone cold. A piece of fabric remained under the needle, a blue dress unfinished. His throat tightened as he reached out and touched the cloth. It was soft, careful, human. He turned as the sound of footsteps echoed behind him. The landlord, a stout man with tired eyes, stood in the doorway. "She left this morning," the landlord said quietly, wiping his hands on his apron. "Didn't say where she was going, just that she was done being found." Ethan froze, the words sinking through him like cold rain through stone. The storm outside howled louder, as if mocking his delay, while inside, silence bloomed. Thick, absolute, final. He looked once more at the unfinished dress on the machine, and realized the cruelest part of regret. Sometimes the person you wronged forgives you long before you ever find them again. The truth has a strange way of crawling back, even through closed doors and buried lies. It moves like light through cracks, unstoppable, patient, and merciless. It does not shout. It whispers, quietly dismantling the illusions built in its absence, until even the most careful liars find their voices trembling. Ethan Cole had spent his life believing control could shield him from chaos, but the truth had found its way to his doorstep once again, carrying both punishment and deliverance in its hands. And somewhere, in a corner of the city he could no longer reach, the woman he had wronged was about to hear her name spoken not in accusation, but in reverence. The days that followed Amara's disappearance were a storm without rain, silent, relentless, impossible to escape. Ethan moved through them like a man walking inside a dream that refused to end. The discovery of Marcus's betrayal had ripped the ground from beneath him, but it also reignited the part of him that refused to live with injustice. For the first time in years, he didn't care about board meetings, reputation, or corporate strategy. His only mission was redemption. He began with evidence, the hard, undeniable kind. Digital trails, bank transfers, access, logs, timestamps. Every false document Marcus had planted became a brick in the case that would destroy him. Ethan worked without rest, coordinating with investigators, tracing every shadow until the lies that had buried Amara began to collapse. The deeper he went, the clearer it became that the web of deceit stretched beyond jealousy. Marcus had been using foundation funds for months, hiding theft beneath Amara's name because she was the perfect scapegoat. New, quiet, without power or defenders. When the case broke, it did not whisper. It roared. The news spread through the media like wildfire. Senior executive arrested in Cole Foundation fraud. Headlines that had once hinted at scandal now flipped their tone, painting Amara as the innocent victim of corruption. The footage of Marcus being led away in handcuffs played on every screen, his arrogance gone, replaced by the hollow stare of a man watching his empire crumble. Justice, long delayed, had finally found its voice. But for Ethan, vindication was not victory. Every newspaper that cleared her name only deepened the wound of how easily he had doubted her. Guilt haunted him like a fever. He stood before cameras and microphones, the polished facade of the billionaire gone, replaced by a man stripped of pretense. The press conference hall was filled to the brim. Journalists, investors, employees, all waiting for a statement that would determine the future of his name. When he stepped to the podium, the room hushed. He took a long breath before speaking, his voice steady, but weighted. "The woman accused in the recent scandal, Miss Amara," he said, pausing as murmurs rippled through the crowd, "was innocent. I failed to protect her, and I failed to believe her when truth demanded faith. Every lie told against her was born from envy, not evidence. The Cole Foundation stands today because of her integrity, not in spite of it." The flash of cameras filled the air like lightning. Reporters scribbled furiously, their questions forgotten in the gravity of his confession. Ethan continued, his gaze fixed forward, unflinching. "To atone for the injustice done under my name, the Foundation will host a charity gala, one dedicated to those who stand for honesty, even when the world stands against them. And tonight," his voice softened, "it will be held in honor of the woman who reminded me what honor truly means." The hall erupted in applause, but Ethan heard none of it. He stepped back, the lights blinding, his pulse echoing in his ears. The moment felt both cleansing and hollow. Redemption offered to the world, but not to the one person who mattered. She wasn't there to hear it. Somewhere, he hoped, she would find out, and maybe that knowledge would soften the shadow he had become in her memory. Across the city, in a narrow street lined with forgotten shops, an old television flickered behind the dusty window of a small tailor's workshop. The room smelled of starch, thread, and rain. Amara sat at her sewing machine, her fingers guiding a piece of fabric beneath the needle. The screen's glow brushed her face as she worked, half listening to the hum of the broadcast. The voice on the TV caught her attention. Low, calm, unmistakable. She turned, and for a heartbeat, the world stilled. Ethan Cole stood on the screen, framed by cameras, confessing his failure to the world. His words were clear, his expression unguarded, his remorse raw enough to reach through the static and touch the air around her. She froze, the fabric slipping from her fingers. Her breath came shallow, her heart pulsing like the needle still poised above the cloth. The shop owner, an elderly woman hemming a jacket nearby, looked up at the broadcast. "He's a brave man," she murmured. "Not many rich ones admit when they're wrong." Amara didn't answer. Her eyes remained fixed on the screen as Ethan spoke about honor, truth, and redemption, about her, without naming her. Every syllable unraveled the wall she had built around herself since leaving him. The anger she had tried to nurture dissolved into something softer, more dangerous, the memory of faith. When the broadcast ended, silence filled the room. The rain outside had stopped, leaving the world hushed and waiting. Amara turned off the machine and sat still for a long time, staring at her reflection in the small shop window. The woman staring back looked different. Not the servant dismissed from a mansion, not the accused defending herself, but someone who had survived the storm, and was now deciding whether to forgive it. Her fingers brushed against the small pendant she still wore, a keepsake from her mother, engraved with a single word: endure. She had endured enough. Perhaps it was time to live again, to face what was left unfinished. She folded the half-stitched dress on the table, her decision forming like dawn breaking through fog. Maybe closure wasn't something that arrived. It was something you went to meet. Outside, the city glittered in twilight. The streetlights shimmered across puddles that no longer frightened her. A poster flapped against a lamppost nearby, the words catching her eye. Cole Foundation Gala, Rebuilding Tomorrow. Beneath the title, in smaller print, the date read, Tonight. She stood there for a moment, her pulse steady, her purpose clear. Forgiveness was not weakness. It was courage dressed in grace. And if the truth had finally found its way back to her name, she would not hide from it. The television screen flickered one last time behind her, replaying Ethan's face as his words echoed through the shop. Her eyes filled with quiet, trembling tears. Not of pain, but of release. She slipped her shawl over her shoulders, locked the door behind her, and stepped into the cool evening air. The night seemed to hum with possibility, every light leading toward the same destination. Somewhere beyond the city, music was already rising, and Amara began to walk toward it, back into the story that destiny had paused, but never ended. Under the glare of cameras, two souls met again, one guilty, one forgiving, both bound by a truth too deep for language. The hall was alive with light and music, but beneath the glittering surface pulsed the quiet heartbeat of redemption, fragile and fierce. For years he had lived beneath chandeliers that could not touch his darkness. Tonight, their glow felt like judgment and mercy combined. And as their eyes met across a crowd that had come to witness generosity, no one realized they were watching a reunion written by fate itself. The grand ballroom of the Cole Foundation Gala shimmered like a dream, crafted to erase the memory of scandal. Chandeliers spilled liquid gold across marble floors, violins whispered through the air, and men and women dressed in their finest masks of grace moved through the light like actors in a story they wanted to believe was real. Cameras lined the walls, hungry lenses ready to devour every smile, every speech, every redemption arc. At the center of it all stood Ethan Cole, immaculate in his black tuxedo, his composure held together by will alone. His eyes scanned the crowd not for investors or dignitaries, but for a face he feared he might never see again. The podium gleamed before him, his speech printed neatly on the glass stand. He began with calm precision, his voice echoing through the room. "Tonight is not a celebration of success," he said, "but a restoration of faith, in people in truth, in the belief that integrity survives even when the world tries to bury it." Applause followed, polite and restrained. He continued, his words measured but his gaze restless, searching the sea of faces for one that mattered more than all the rest. "This foundation exists because of the courage of one woman, someone who taught me that honesty is not the absence of error, but the presence of grace." Unseen by most, Amara had entered quietly through the side door, her simple gown the color of moonlight against the dark suits and sequined dresses. She carried no jewelry, no announcement, only the stillness of someone who had already lived through storms far greater than any room could hold. The noise of the gala seemed to fade as she took her first steps into the hall. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with the strange disbelief that life could still bring her to moments like this, moments where endings folded back into beginnings. She moved toward the back of the crowd, unnoticed, content to watch from the shadows. And then, as Ethan spoke the final lines of his address, his eyes caught hers. For a moment, time forgot to move. The air between them thickened. The lights dimmed in his vision until only her face remained, luminous and unreal. The speech he had rehearsed vanished from memory. He faltered, words crumbling into silence. The audience shifted, uncertain, cameras tilting, to capture the man who had built empires, now standing speechless in front of one woman. He stepped down from the stage without a word, ignoring the murmurs, the flashing lights, the whispers of confusion. The orchestra hesitated, then fell quiet. Every eye turned as he crossed the polished floor, his footsteps echoing like thunder disguised as humility. Amara stood frozen, her breath trembling, her instinct urging her to retreat, but her heart refusing to move. When he reached her, the room was so still that even the chandeliers seemed to lean closer to listen. "Amara," he said softly, his voice breaking beneath the weight of her name. "I don't deserve to stand before you." She tried to speak, but emotion caught her throat. He continued, his words meant for her, but carried by the microphones to everyone present. "You gave me truth, and I repaid it with doubt. You showed me loyalty, and I answered with fear. I believed lies because it was easier than believing in goodness, and for that, I am sorry, before you and before everyone who ever thought I was a man of judgment." The crowd held its breath. No one moved. Cameras zoomed in, lights blazed brighter, but even the media's hunger felt hushed in the face of something this raw. Amara's eyes glistened, not from the spectacle, but from the sincerity she could no longer deny. The man who had once commanded boardrooms now stood before her, stripped of everything but remorse. She could have turned away, could have let pride win, could have let history repeat its cruelty. Instead, she stepped forward, her voice calm, but trembling with the power of forgiveness. "I forgive you," she said simply. The words fell into the silence, like rain onto dry earth. Ethan's eyes closed for a brief moment, as if the sound alone had the power to heal every wound he had carried since Isabella's death, since Amara's departure, since the night he stopped believing in grace. The crowd erupted into applause, hesitant at first, then rising like a wave that filled the room with warmth. The journalists lowered their cameras, the guests wiped discreet tears, and for the first time in years, Ethan Cole smiled not for the public, but for himself. He took her hand, not as an apology, but as a promise. "You taught me that truth doesn't demand perfection. It demands courage," he whispered. "If you'll let me, I'd like to spend what's left of my life proving I've learned that lesson." Amara's smile was faint, but radiant. "Then begin with tonight," she said. The orchestra resumed softly, the violins weaving through the air like threads of light. People began to move again, conversations resuming, but the two of them remained still, surrounded by the quiet intimacy of understanding. For the first time, the chandeliers above seemed kind. The same lights that had once witnessed her humiliation now shone upon her vindication. The woman who had been thrown into the storm stood now at the center of her own dawn, her head high, her forgiveness turning her pain into grace. Ethan glanced around the hall, his voice steady as he addressed the crowd one last time. "Tonight," he said, "let this moment remind us that wealth is worthless without humility, and that no empire is stronger than the heart that keeps it human." The applause rose again, a standing ovation this time, louder, truer, breaking through years of silence and guilt. Amara looked at him, pride and peace reflected in her eyes. For the first time since they met, both of them stood not as savior and servant, not as accuser and accused, but as equals before the light. And then, just as the applause swelled, something shifted. A small sound escaped Ethan's lips, a sharp intake of breath that went unnoticed at first. His hand, still clasping hers, trembled. The color drained from his face. The music faltered as he reached for his chest, his expression changing from relief to sudden pain. Amara's smile vanished. The applause turned to confusion as Ethan's body swayed, his fingers tightening around hers before slipping away. The hall blurred into chaos, voices rising, cameras flashing, But all Amara could see was the man who had just found redemption collapsing beneath the same lights that had once blinded him. She caught him as he fell, her cry drowned beneath the echo of gasps and shattered glasses. His eyes met hers one last time, filled with peace instead of fear. And as the crowd rushed forward, the chandeliers above flickered, the light dimming, then returning, as if even heaven itself refused to let the story end in darkness. Beeping monitors counted the seconds between goodbye and forever, their rhythm echoing like the frail heartbeat of destiny refusing to give up. Hospitals have a way of turning time into glass, fragile, slow, reflecting every regret you thought you could outrun. The scent of antiseptic filled the room, sharp and cold, yet beneath it lingered the warmth of a woman's devotion that refused to fade. Amara sat beside the bed, her trembling hand over his motionless one, whispering prayers not to God of the heavens, but to the God of second chances. The night of the gala had ended in chaos, the sound of applause replaced by screams and sirens. Cameras that once captured triumph now documented fear, and as Ethan's body was rushed through the sea of confusion, Amara ran alongside, her gown torn, her tears blending with the rain that began to fall again, as if heaven mourned with her. The ambulance lights painted her face in flashes of red and white, each flicker carving panic into her soul. Inside, the paramedics worked fast, oxygen masks, IV lines, whispered numbers that meant nothing and everything. She held his hand through it all, murmuring his name like a prayer that refused to end. When they reached the hospital, time fractured into fragments, doors swinging open, doctors shouting, her being pulled back as they wheeled him through. "Ma'am, please wait outside." The words stabbed deeper than any accusation ever had. She stood there in the hallway, surrounded by white walls and the sterile hum of machines, her body trembling, but her eyes unblinking, fixed on the door that had swallowed him. Minutes turned to hours. The gown that had once made her feel strong now clung to her like grief itself. At last, a doctor stepped out, his face composed, professional, but his tone soft enough to recognize her pain. "Mr. Cole has a congenital heart condition," he explained. "We managed to stabilize him, but the strain tonight caused severe cardiac distress. He's unconscious, but still fighting." Amara's voice broke as she whispered, "Can I see him?" He nodded. "Yes, but he needs rest, and you need strength." The room was quiet, bathed in dim light from the city beyond the glass. Machines surrounded the bed, their gentle hums and beeps creating a fragile symphony that sounded like life clinging to its promise. Ethan lay still, his face pale yet peaceful, a thin line of oxygen running across his lips. Amara pulled the chair close, her knees brushing the cold metal frame. For a long time she said nothing, her silence full of everything words could not contain. Then she reached for his hand, warm still, though weaker than she remembered, and held it with both of hers. "Do you remember?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "The night it rained, and you asked if I needed help. I didn't know then that it was you who needed saving." Her fingers brushed his wrist, as if her touch could remind his pulse how to continue. "You gave me hope when I thought kindness was gone from the world. You believed in me when no one else did. And then you stopped. But even then, I never hated you, Ethan. I only wished you'd believe in yourself as much as I once believed in you." Her voice cracked under the weight of the memories flooding back. She began to speak softly, recounting them one by one. The first storm, the first smile, the first morning she walked into his study afraid and walked out trusted. "You showed me that walls made of power still have doors that kindness can open," she said. "You taught me that forgiveness isn't a gift, it's a way of setting the soul free. And I forgave you long before you ever asked, because I saw the truth you were too proud to see in yourself." Her tears fell onto his hand, disappearing into the white sheet beneath. "You think the world sees you as powerful," she whispered, "but I saw you as human. and that's what made you great." The monitors continued their steady rhythm, each beep a fragile heartbeat echoing her faith. She bowed her head and began to pray, her lips moving silently, not begging, but thanking the heavens for letting her love him at all. Hours passed like seasons. Nurses came and went, checking readings, adjusting wires. But Amara remained unmoving, her body bent, with exhaustion, yet her spirit unbroken. At some point near dawn, her eyes fluttered closed, and sleep claimed her in the chair beside him. She dreamed of sunlight spilling through the mansion windows, of laughter returning to the garden, of Ethan's voice calling her name not with sorrow, but with peace. In her dream, they were both free, two souls walking in the rain without fear. When she woke, the first thing she saw was his face, unchanged, still caught in the space between life and departure. Panic surged briefly until she heard the faint, steady rhythm of the monitor. She leaned forward, brushing his hair from his forehead, her whisper barely a breath. "You once said, 'Truth demands courage,'" she murmured. "Then fight, Ethan. Fight for yours." As if sensing her voice, a flicker crossed his expression, a faint twitch of the fingers beneath hers. Her breath caught. She leaned closer, hope blooming where despair had rooted itself. "That's it," she whispered. "Come back." But the flicker faded. His stillness returned. She pressed her forehead against his hand, her tears falling faster now. The monitors began to shift, their rhythm uneven, uncertain. A nurse entered, alarm flashing across her face as she called for the doctor. The room filled with urgency, footsteps, voices, commands. But for Amara, sound had dissolved into a single, dreadful frequency, the rising pitch of panic. The doctor's voice broke through faintly. "He's going into arrest. Get the defibrillator." Hands moved, machines screamed, but Amara's world had narrowed to the sound of one line, flattening into forever. The flatline tone screamed through the room, slicing through prayer, memory, and time itself. Amara's knees hit the floor beside his bed as the doctors moved around her, their voices a blur of desperate instruction. She clasped his hand tighter, her tears soaking the white sheets. "You promised to fight, Ethan," she whispered through the noise, her voice shaking yet fierce. "You promised me the rain wouldn't take you again." The monitors held their merciless note, and in that soundless scream of machines, love and fate stood at war. Some miracles don't happen in light. They happen in the quiet faith of a heart that refuses to quit, in the shadowed hours when prayer sounds more like breathing than words. The world calls it luck when life returns where it should have ended. But Amara knew better. She had seen hope die twice and rise again, gentle as dawn. Love had fought its hardest battle in the silence between two heartbeats. And though machines had screamed defeat, faith had whispered louder. When Ethan opened his eyes weeks later, the first thing he saw was her, the woman who had once forgiven him before he even asked. The hospital had held its breath that night, and when his pulse returned, it felt less like survival and more like resurrection. Months passed in slow, measured days. His body, fragile from years of buried pain, relearned the rhythm of living. Amara never left his side. She slept in the chair by his bed, worked from the corner of his room, and reminded the doctors to treat him as a man, not a miracle. Every morning, she would open the blinds and let the light in, whispering, "The world is still waiting for you, Ethan Cole. Don't keep it waiting too long." The road to recovery was long, but it was the kind of struggle that made both of them gentler. The man who once moved mountains now measured success by the strength to walk across the room. The woman who had once feared every door closing learned that sometimes healing requires standing still. Together, they built their days around small victories, a steady heartbeat, a smile that returned, a conversation that no longer ended in silence. When the doctors finally discharged him, the staff stood in quiet respect. They had seen thousands of recoveries, but few rebirths. Ethan left the hospital leaning on Amara's arm, not because he needed support, but because he wanted to remember what it felt like to walk beside the person who had taught him how to stand again. The mansion, once a house of guilt and memory, felt different now. The shadows seemed softer, the silence kinder. Ethan returned to his foundation, not as a man reclaiming authority, but as one reclaiming purpose. At his first board meeting, he stood before his team, his voice calm but resolute. "From this day forward," he said, "the Cole Foundation will not just build futures, it will rebuild lives. And no one knows how to do that better than the woman sitting beside me." The room fell silent as he turned to Amara. "Miss Amara will serve as our new Director of Human Initiatives." Gasps rippled through the boardroom, not from disbelief, but from the quiet awe of witnessing justice fulfilled. Amara rose slowly, her eyes moist, her composure steady. "Thank you," she said simply. "But this isn't about titles. It's about second chances, the ones we're given, and the ones we owe others." Her voice carried across the room with the authority of grace, a power born not of position, but of compassion. Under their leadership, the Foundation's mission transformed. The first project they launched together was a shelter for women like Amara, maids, widows, outcasts, and dreamers the world had overlooked. They called it the House of Second Chances. It stood in the very district where Amara had once rented her small room, rising from the same soil where her tears had fallen. The shelter offered not pity, but dignity. Sewing rooms for skill, classrooms for learning, beds for rest, and gardens where silence felt like healing instead of punishment. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, the press arrived again, cameras flashing, microphones ready. But this time, there were no scandals to chase, no questions sharpened like knives, only stories of hope waiting to be told. Ethan spoke briefly, his voice steady, his hand resting over Amara's. "This building exists because one woman refused to let despair become destiny," he said. "May every soul who walks through its doors find what I found when I met her: faith, forgiveness, and the courage to begin again." The applause that followed was warm, unhurried, the kind that carries gratitude instead of spectacle. As guests moved inside, Ethan turned to Amara. "You built this," he said quietly. "You saved me twice, first from my pride, and then from death." She smiled softly. "You gave me a place to believe again. Maybe we saved each other." The seasons that followed were gentle ones. Their partnership, once built on guilt and distance, grew into something unspoken and infinite. In the evenings, they walked through the garden Isabella had once designed, where new flowers now grew beside old roots. The house no longer mourned. It had learned how to breathe again. And when the time came to turn their bond into something eternal, they chose not a cathedral or a ballroom, but a small chapel on the hill overlooking the shelter they had built together. Their wedding was quiet. A handful of friends, the women from the shelter, the scent of lilies and rain in the air. Amara wore a simple gown, her hands trembling only when Ethan reached for them. He looked at her, not as the woman who had once worked for him, nor the one who had forgiven him, but as the companion who had taught him that love, at its truest, is service made sacred. When the vows were spoken, their words were less promise and more remembrance, a shared recognition of everything they had already endured and everything they had already become. After the ceremony, the sky turned silver with clouds, and a soft rain began to fall. Guests rushed for cover, laughing, but Amara stayed where she was, standing in the open doorway of the chapel, the droplets catching in her hair like diamonds. She looked up at the sky, her eyes glistening not with sorrow, but with peace. For the first time, rain did not mean exile. It meant blessing. Ethan joined her, slipping his arm around her shoulders, his voice low and filled with quiet wonder. "The same rain," he said. "Only now it feels like home." She leaned into him, the warmth of his presence grounding her as thunder murmured softly across the horizon. Around them, the shelter's lights began to glow through the rain, a beacon for every soul still searching for their second chance. The house stood tall against the storm, its walls built not of wealth, but of faith, forgiveness, and endurance. And in that glow, Amara finally understood what her journey had been leading her toward all along. Not riches, not recognition, but redemption that healed both giver and receiver alike. As the rain mirrored her first night of pain, Amara closed her eyes and lifted her face to the sky, the water blending with her tears in perfect harmony. "Thank you, God," she whispered softly, her voice carried by the wind. "For every door that closed, so this one could open." Ethan smiled beside her, his hand finding hers. The world around them washed clean once more. The rain fell harder, not in sorrow but in celebration, as the house of second chances stood gleaming beneath the storm. And for the first time in a long, unforgiving world, grace had finally come full circle. If this story touched your heart, don't let it end here. Be part of our journey of hope, faith, and second chances. Subscribe now and stay with us as we bring more stories that remind you light always returns after every storm. Your one click, one comment, one share keeps these voices alive. Voices that speak of love, redemption, and courage. Stay inspired, stay kind, because somewhere, another Amara is still waiting for her miracle.